Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The ocean breathes. On a calm day, it is a slow, steady respiration, the gentle rise and fall of the tide against a sandy shore. But in the vast, empty loneliness of the open sea, that breath can become a roar. It is a place of profound isolation, where a single vessel is a tiny, fragile world unto itself, a speck of human endeavor, surrounded by an indifferent and often hostile wilderness of water and sky. The North Atlantic in winter is particularly unforgiving. It is a realm of steel-gray waves and biting winds, a cold desert where horizons are endless, and help is often an illusion. It is in this wilderness, on the 4th of December 1872, that the crew of the Canadian brigantine Dei Gratia saw something that did not belong. It was a ship, another two-masted brigantine like their own, but it moved with an unsettling, erratic gait. It yawed in the wind, its sails poorly set and some torn, as if helmed by a drunkard or a ghost. Captain David Morehouse watched the vessel through his spyglass from the deck of the Dei Gratia. He was a practical man of the sea, not given to flights of fancy. His vessel was running a routine course, carrying a cargo of petroleum from New York to Gibraltar. This other ship was on a similar heading, about 6 miles off his port bow, but it was clear something was profoundly wrong. No one was visible on deck. No one was at the wheel. As the Dei Gratia drew closer over the next few hours, a knot of professional unease tightened in Captain Morehouse's stomach. He recognized the ship. There was no mistaking her lines. It was the Mary Celeste. The name sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the sea air. He knew her captain, Benjamin Spooner Briggs. They were not just acquaintances. They were friends, men cut from the same New England cloth. They had dined together in New York just before setting sail a few weeks prior. Briggs was a good man, a teetotaler, a devout Christian, and an eminently capable, experienced mariner. He was not the kind of man to command a vessel in such a slovenly, dangerous state. Morehouse hailed the ship. Once, twice. The only answer was the groan of timber and the snap of canvas in the wind. The silence from the deck of the Mary Celeste was absolute, a heavy, unnatural void that seemed to absorb the sound. After 2 hours of observation with no sign of life, he ordered his chief mate, Oliver Deveau, to take 2 other seamen and board the mysterious vessel. As their small boat cut through the choppy waves towards the Mary Celeste, the silence seemed to grow deeper, more profound. The ship loomed over them, a silent, abandoned stage. What Deveau and his men would find on board would not be the grisly scene of a mutiny, or the wreckage of a catastrophic storm. Instead, they would find something far more unsettling, a scene of ordinary life, abruptly and inexplicably frozen in time. They would find a ship under sail, in good condition, fully provisioned, yet utterly devoid of human life. The 10 souls who had sailed on her, Captain Briggs, his wife, his 2-year-old daughter, and a crew of 7, had vanished from the face of the earth. Their disappearance would launch one of the greatest maritime mysteries of all time. It would become a story retold and embellished for over a century, a tale populated with theories of sea monsters, pirates, mutinies, and malevolent paranormal forces. But the truth, if it can be found, lies not in fantasy, but in the subtle clues left behind on that silent deck. It lies in the character of the men who sailed her, the nature of her cargo, and the unforgiving physics of the sea itself. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a maritime enigma. We strip away the myth and legend to examine the cold, hard facts of the ghost ship, the Mary Celeste, and the enduring, chilling question of how a vessel could become a tomb with no bodies, a crime scene with no crime. To understand the mystery of the Mary Celeste, we must first understand the vessel herself. She was not born with that name, and a current of misfortune seemed to run through her keel from the very beginning. She was launched in 1861 from the shipyard on Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, under the name Amazon. She was a brigantine, a workhorse of the seas, 103 feet long, not particularly large, but sturdy. Her very first master, Captain Robert McClellan, contracted pneumonia just days after taking command, and died before her maiden voyage even began. It was a dark omen. On that first trip across the Atlantic, she collided with a fishing brig in the English Channel, sending the other vessel to the bottom. The Amazon herself sustained significant damage and had to limp into port for repairs. A few years later, she was sold after her owners faced financial ruin. Her new proprietors fared little better. The ship seemed to bleed money, haunted by small accidents and unprofitable journeys. In 1867, she ran aground in a storm off Cape Breton Island and was so badly damaged that her owners abandoned her as a wreck. She should have ended her days there, a collection of broken timbers on a rocky shore. But she was salvaged, purchased by a New York mariner named Richard W. Haynes. He spent a small fortune, nearly twice her purchase price, rebuilding her. He made her larger, deeper, added a second deck, and in 1868 he registered her under a new name, hoping to cast off her unlucky past. He called her Mary Celeste. The name, likely a variation of Maria Celeste, has a celestial, almost heavenly ring to it, but for this vessel, it would become synonymous with something far more spectral. The bad luck, it seemed, was not in the name, but in the wood itself. Haynes, like those before him, quickly went bankrupt, and the ship was seized by his creditors. She was sold again, this time to a small consortium of New York businessmen, the principal shareholder being a man named James H. Winchester. It was Winchester who, in 1872, offered command of the vessel, along with a one-third share of ownership, to a man he trusted implicitly, Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs. Briggs was the very model of a 19th century New England sea captain. Born in Wareham, Massachusetts, in 1835, he was part of a maritime dynasty. The sea was in his blood. He and his 4 brothers all became captains, pursuing a life of discipline and danger on the world's oceans. Benjamin was known for his unimpeachable integrity, his deep and abiding Christian faith, and his skill as a navigator and commander. He was a teetotaler, abstaining from alcohol in an era when it was the lifeblood of many sailors, a decision that earned him respect for his clear-headedness and self-control. By age 37, he was a seasoned master mariner with a pristine reputation. He was known to be firm but fair with his crews, a man who believed in order, discipline, and the Word of God. This voyage was to be a significant milestone for him. Investing his life savings into a share of the Mary Celeste was a major step towards securing his family's future. He wasn't just an employee, he was a partner in the venture. And for this voyage, he was bringing his family with him. His wife, Sarah Elizabeth Cobb Briggs, was the daughter of a congregational minister, and she shared her husband's quiet piety. They had 2 children, a 7-year-old son, Arthur, and a 2-year-old daughter, Sophia Matilda. In a decision that must have been weighed heavily, they chose to leave Arthur behind with his grandmother in Marion, Massachusetts, so he wouldn't miss his schooling. But Sarah and little Sophia would join the captain. The presence of a wife and child on a merchant vessel was uncommon, but not unheard of. It suggests Captain Briggs viewed the Mary Celeste as a sound, safe ship, and the voyage to Genoa as a routine, low-risk passage. He planned to make their small cabin a floating home. Sarah brought along her melodeon, a small pump organ, and her sewing machine, determined to create a pocket of domestic warmth in the vast emptiness of the sea. The crew Captain Briggs assembled was small, just 7 men to handle the complex web of ropes and sails on the 2-masted brigantine. The first mate, Albert G. Richardson, was a 28-year-old American from Maine, a married man who had sailed with Briggs before and was considered a trusted officer. The second mate was Andrew Gilling, around 25 years old and also American, from New York. The steward and cook was Edward William Head, a newlywed from Brooklyn. The 4 remaining able-bodied seamen were all German. 2 were brothers, Volkert and Bas Lorenzen, from the Frisian Islands. The others were Arian Martins and Gottlieb Gaudschall. Later investigations would pore over the histories of these men, searching for any hint of instability or malice. Nothing was ever found. They were described by those who knew them in New York as peaceable, sober, and experienced sailors. They were simply working men, hired for a standard transatlantic crossing, seeking a paycheck, not infamy. On November 5, 1872, the Mary Celeste was towed from her pier in New York City's bustling East River. She anchored for 2 days, waiting for a storm system to pass. On November 7th, a crisp autumn day, she weighed anchor and sailed past Staten Island, out into the vast expa. NSE of the Atlantic. Aboard were 10 souls, carrying a cargo of 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol, a substance intended not for drinking, but for fortifying Italian wines. They left a world of bustling cities and familiar shores for the profound solitude of the sea. None of them would ever be seen again. Almost a full month later, and 400 miles east of the Azores, the men from the Dei Gratia climbed over the rail and onto the deck of the Mary Celeste. Chief Mate Oliver DeVoe was the first man aboard. The first thing he noticed was the profound, unnatural quiet. It was a dead silence, broken only by the rhythmic groan of the ship's timbers and the sloshing wash of waves against the hull. The ship was sailing herself, but a ship under sail is a complex machine that demands constant attention. The wheel was unmanned, spinning freely with the motion of the sea. The ship's binnacle, which housed the compass, had been knocked from its place and was shattered. DeVoe, a seasoned mariner, began a methodical inspection. The ship was wet, her decks awash, indicating she had taken on some heavy seas. He sounded the hold and found about 3.5 feet of water sloshing in the bilge. But this was not an alarming amount for a wooden ship of her size after weeks at sea. She was certainly not sinking, and the single pump on board was later found to be in perfect working order. The state of the rigging told a confusing story. Some sails were set and drawing wind, which explained why the ship was still moving, albeit erratically. Specifically, the foresail and upper foretopsail were set, but others, like the main staysail, had been blown away or were hanging in tatters. This suggested the ship had encountered at least one bout of heavy weather, but the damage was not catastrophic. The overall condition of the vessel was sound. She was, as DeVoe would later report to the inquiry, a perfectly good ship. The disturbing clues were in the details of the abandonment. The ship's only lifeboat, a small yawl that was normally stowed securely on top of the main cargo hatch, was gone. The davits from which it would be launched were swung outboard. This was the first clear sign that the crew had deliberately and intentionally left the vessel. But why would a crew abandon a ship that was not sinking? The search moved below decks, into the eerie quiet of the ship's interior. In the forecastle, the crew's living quarters, they found seamen's chests and clothing, all neatly stowed. Oilskin boots and pipes lay where they had been left. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no bloodstains. Everything was orderly, almost mundane. as if the crew had just stepped out and would be back at any moment. The ship's galley was similarly undisturbed. There were ample provisions, enough food and fresh water for 6 months. The last meal seemed to have been prepared, but perhaps not finished. In the mate's cabin, the ship's logbook was found lying open on the desk. The final entry was dated at 8 a.m. on the morning of November 25th, 9 full days before the discovery. It recorded the ship's position as being just off the Azores island of Santa Maria. The entry was routine, noting weather, wind direction, and position. It gave no hint of any trouble or concern. On a slate in the cabin, a note recorded the ship reaching the eastern point of the island of St. Mary's at 6 a.m. that same day. Everything seemed to have been perfectly normal until some point after that last log entry. The most poignant discoveries, the ones that truly communicated the human tragedy of the situation, were made in the captain's cabin. This small space had clearly been a family home. Sarah Briggs's melodeon was propped up against a wall. Her sewing machine stood nearby, and next to it, a small vial of oil for its mechanism was resting upright, undisturbed by any violent motion. Under the captain's bed was his sword, tucked away in its sheath. In the drawers, Sarah's clothes and jewelry were still in place. In a corner, toys belonging to 2-year-old Sophia lay scattered on the floor. The impression was one of a sudden departure, but not a panicked or violent one. It was as if the family had intended to step out for a moment and return. Crucially, while the cabin was in order, several key items were missing. The ship's papers, which are essential for any port of call, were gone. Also missing were the captain's navigational instruments, his sextant and chronometer. The absence of these items is highly significant. They are the essential tools for determining a ship's position at sea. No captain would abandon his vessel, even in an emergency, without them if he had the time to collect them. Their removal suggests a planned, though perhaps hasty, evacuation into the lifeboat. However, the ship's cash box and the crew's valuables were all left behind, arguing against any theory of robbery. The cargo hold presented another piece of the puzzle. The 1,701 barrels of alcohol were largely intact and in good order, the stowage secure. The manifest was checked against the cargo, and only 9 of the barrels were found to be empty. These 9 barrels were made from red oak, which is known to be more porous than the white oak used for the others. This small, seemingly insignificant detail of cooperage would later become a cornerstone of the most plausible theory. After a thorough inspection that took the better part of an hour, Oliver Deveau was certain. The crew was gone, but the ship was sound. He returned to the Dei Gratia and made his report. Captain Morehouse was now faced with a difficult decision. Maritime law entitled the rescuer of an abandoned ship, a derelict, to a significant salvage payment. But to claim it, he would have to split his own crew of 8 men, sending half to sail the ghost ship hundreds of miles to the nearest port. It was a risky maneuver that would leave both vessels dangerously undermanned. But the potential reward was great, and there was also the matter of duty to his vanished friend. Morehouse made the call. He put Deveau in charge of the Mary Celeste with 2 of his best seamen. The 2 ships then set a course for Gibraltar. The silent brigantine now crewed by strangers, its profound mystery sailing with it. The arrival of the Mary Celeste in Gibraltar on December 13, 1872, did not bring clarity. Instead, it marked the beginning of a legal and investigative ordeal that would obscure the facts and fuel speculation for generations. The proceedings were handled by a Vice-Admiralty Court, a powerful legal body designed to adjudicate maritime matters. The man in charge of the investigation was the Queen's Proctor and Attorney General for Gibraltar, a man named Frederick Solly Flood. Solly Flood was, by all accounts, a man of immense self-regard and limited imagination. He was immediately and unshakably suspicious of the story told by Captain Morehouse and his crew. The idea of a perfectly sound ship being abandoned on the high seas for no apparent reason struck him as utterly unbelievable. In his mind, there had to be foul play, and the most likely culprits were the men who stood to gain from the ship's discovery, the crew of the Dei Gratia. Solly Flood's theory was simple, brutal, and devoid of evidence. He believed that Captain Morehouse had conspired with the crew of the Mary Celeste to create a fraudulent salvage claim, or, more sinisterly, had overtaken the vessel on the high seas, murdered Captain Briggs, his family, and all 7 crewmen, thrown their bodies overboard, and then sailed the ship to Gibraltar to collect the prize money. He fixated on the idea of violence. He ordered the Mary Celeste to be minutely examined by his surveyors, not to find the cause of the abandonment, but to find proof of his preconceived conclusion. They reported finding a few small dark stains on the deck, which Solly Flood immediately and publicly declared to be blood. A decorative sword found in Captain Briggs's cabin was also noted to have a similar reddish stain on its blade. He pointed to what he described as deep cuts on the ship's railing, which he claimed were made by an axe during a violent struggle. He even suggested that the ship had been deliberately damaged to fake a story of bad weather. These discoveries formed the basis of Solly Flood's case for foul play. He subjected the crew of the Dei Gratia to a grueling accusatory inquiry that lasted for 3 months. Captain Morehouse, a man of good standing, found his character and that of his men viciously attacked in court. His friendship with Captain Briggs was twisted into a motive for a complex and murderous conspiracy. However, under cross-examination and independent analysis, Solly Flood's entire case began to crumble. The supposed bloodstains on the deck were tested and found to be inconclusive, almost certainly nothing more than rust or stains from the cargo. The stain on the sword was carefully analyzed by a cutler from the British Royal Navy, who definitively determined it to be rust, with not a single trace of blood. The axe marks on the railing were examined by experienced shipwrights who concluded they were likely the natural result of weathering and sea wear on the wooden rails, common on any ship that had spent time at sea. There was simply no physical evidence of a struggle or any violence aboard the Mary Celeste. Furthermore, the logic of Solly Flood's theories was deeply flawed. The cargo of alcohol was denatured, a fact he seemed to ignore. It was poisonous and undrinkable. The idea of a drunken mutiny was therefore highly unlikely. The theory that Morehouse and his crew were responsible was even more far-fetched. It would have required a perfectly timed rendezvous in the middle of the vast Atlantic, a bloody massacre that left no trace, the cleaning of the entire ship, and the disposal of 10 bodies, all for a salvage award that was by no means guaranteed. It was a plot worthy of a penny dreadful novel, not the reality of 19th century seamanship. Despite the collapse of his case, Solly Flood's suspicions had irrevocably tainted the proceedings. When the court finally issued its judgment, it awarded the salvors only £1,700, a paltry sum, a fraction of the ship and cargo's total value of over £9,000. The judge's official report made it clear that while there was no proof of wrongdoing, a very great deal of suspicion remained. Frederick Solly Flood, through his incompetence and obstinance, had failed to solve the mystery. Instead, he had created the perfect conditions for myth and legend to take root. He had muddied the waters so thoroughly that the truth of what happened on the Mary Celeste might never be found. With the official inquiry providing no answers, the fate of the Mary Celeste's crew became a blank canvas onto which a world of theories could be painted. Over the next century and a half, explanations have ranged from the logical to the utterly fantastical. To truly dissect the anatomy of this mystery, we must examine these theories, weighing the evidence for and against each one, and peeling back the layers of speculation. The first and most sensational category of theories involves human violence. We have already addressed Frederick Sollyflood's unsupported belief that the Dei Gratia crew were murderers, a theory dismissed by almost all serious researchers due to the lack of evidence and motive. But what of other forms of foul play? Could the crew of the Mary Celeste have mutinied? The story goes that the German sailors, perhaps enraged by some perceived slight from Captain Briggs, or maddened by the isolation of the sea, rose up, murdered the captain, his wife, their child, and the loyal officers, and then fled in the lifeboat. This theory gained some traction in the sensationalist press of the time, playing on anti-immigrant sentiments. But it falls apart under even basic scrutiny. Captain Briggs had a reputation as a fair and just commander. Mutinies were typically a response to brutal captains or abysmal conditions, neither of which were present. Furthermore, the scene on the ship belies a bloody struggle. The cabin was orderly, personal possessions were untouched, and no signs of a fight were ever found. Why would a mutinous crew murder everyone on board, only to abandon a perfectly good ship and take their chances in a tiny boat in the middle of the Atlantic? It makes no logical sense. Another popular theory in the 19th century was piracy. Perhaps the Mary Celeste was set upon by Riffian pirates from the coast of North Africa. The story would be that the pirates boarded the ship, forced the crew and passengers into the lifeboat and set them adrift, and then, for some reason, abandoned the vessel themselves. This, too, is highly improbable. While piracy still existed in some parts of the world in 1872, it was exceedingly rare in that particular Atlantic shipping lane, which was heavily patrolled. More importantly, the evidence on the ship itself argues against it. The cargo of industrial alcohol was of little value to pirates. The personal belongings of the crew and the Briggs family, including Sarah's jewelry and the ship's cash box, were all left behind. Pirates are, by definition, thieves. The absence of any theft makes the piracy theory untenable. The Mary Celeste was not the victim of a crime we can easily understand, like murder or robbery. The evidence points to something stranger, something that caused 10 people to willingly step off a safe vessel and into almost certain death. This leads us to the category of natural phenomena. Could some terrifying, freak event of nature have driven the crew to abandon ship? One long-standing theory involves a waterspout. A waterspout is a tornado over water, a violent vortex that could certainly have threatened a vessel like the Mary Celeste. Proponents of this theory suggest that a waterspout struck or passed very near the ship, tearing the sails and dumping a large amount of water on board. Terrified by the event, and perhaps believing the ship was taking on water much faster than it was, Captain Briggs ordered a temporary evacuation to the lifeboat. This theory accounts for the torn sails and the water found in the hold. However, it has weaknesses. A waterspout violent enough to cause such panic in an experienced crew would likely have caused far more significant structural damage, yet the ship was found to be sound. Furthermore, the ship's logbook with its last entry on November 25th made no mention of severe weather. While a sudden squall could have appeared after the last entry, it seems unlikely it would have been of such a uniquely terrifying nature. A more exotic, though not impossible, natural explanation is a seaquake. This is a phenomenon where a submarine earthquake creates a violent, non-destructive shaking of the water's surface. A ship caught in a seaquake would be violently rattled and shaken, with loud, unnerving rumbling sounds coming from the deep. To a crew that had never experienced such a thing, it might have seemed like the world was coming to an end, or that the ship was about to break apart beneath their feet. This could have induced a panic sufficient to cause them to abandon ship. The problem with this theory is the complete lack of evidence. There is no record of any seismic activity in that region of the Atlantic during that time period. While it's a compelling and dramatic idea, it remains pure speculation, and so we must turn from the outside forces of weather and geology and look inside the ship, into its cargo hold. The answer to the riddle of the Mary Celeste is likely not found in the supernatural, but in the mundane chemistry of its cargo. Of all the theories put forth, one has emerged as the most comprehensive and scientifically plausible. It does not rely on violence, sea monsters, or freak weather events. Instead, it focuses on those 9 empty barrels of alcohol in the hold. This is the vapor explosion theory. The cargo was 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol. As we noted, 9 of these barrels were made of porous red oak, not the more resilient white oak. The fundamental difference between these two woods is a microscopic structure called a tylose. White oak is filled with them, making it waterproof and ideal for liquid-tight barrels. Red oak lacks these structures, making it far more porous. Why some barrels were red oak is unknown. Perhaps a simple matter of supply at the docks. The Mary Celeste had sailed from the cold of a New York November into the warmer, sunnier climate of the Azores. This change in temperature would have caused the alcohol in the barrels to vaporize, building up a significant amount of flammable vapor and pressure within the enclosed space of the cargo hold. The theory posits that the pressure from the 9 porous red oak barrels reached a critical point. It did not result in a fiery, Hollywood-style explosion. Denatured alcohol has a very low flash point. The buildup of vapor could have created a pressure wave explosion, a sudden, violent release of vapor that would be more of a loud, whooshing bang than a fiery blast. This event would have been powerful enough to blow the main hatch cover off its supports and send a wave of noxious, invisible, and flammable fumes billowing onto the deck. To Captain Briggs and his crew, this event would have been utterly terrifying. They would have heard a violent sound from below decks, seen the heavy hatch cover thrown aside, and smelled the potent fumes of the alcohol. They would not have known if this was a precursor to a much larger, ship-destroying explosion. Captain Briggs was a responsible man. His wife and young daughter were on board. His primary duty, above all else, would have been to ensure their safety. Faced with the imminent and terrifying possibility that his ship could become a fireball at any moment, Briggs may have made a fateful but logical decision. A temporary and precautionary evacuation. He would have ordered everyone into the yawl, the ship's only lifeboat. This was not a panicked, every man for himself, abandonment. It was an orderly, if rushed, procedure. This explains why he would have taken the ship's papers and his vital navigational instruments. He fully intended to return to the ship once the danger had passed. To ensure they would not be separated from their vessel, they would have likely attached a long tow line, perhaps the main peak halyard, a rope hundreds of feet long, from the lifeboat to the Mary Celeste. They would have paid out the line, rowing to a safe distance to wait and watch, to see if the ship would explode. And here is the final, tragic piece of the puzzle. The Mary Celeste did not explode. The vapor release was a one-time event. The danger was over as soon as it began. But as the small lifeboat bobbed in the waves, a new danger emerged. The ship, with some of its sails still set, was a ghost, catching the wind and moving steadily forward. Perhaps a sudden gust of wind put too much strain on the towline and it snapped. Or perhaps over several minutes of bobbing and pulling, the rope simply chafed on the ship's rail and broke. Suddenly, the crew in their small boat were untethered from their ship. They would have watched in horror as the Mary Celeste, their only hope of survival, slowly but surely sailed away from them. They were in a tiny open boat in the middle of the vast Atlantic Ocean. They could not have hoped to row fast enough to catch the larger wind-driven vessel. They were left behind, adrift. Their fate from that point on is unknown, but it was almost certainly grim. They would have succumbed to exposure, dehydration, or a storm. The ocean would have swallowed them whole, leaving no trace. This theory is the only one that elegantly explains nearly all of the strange facts of the case, turning a supernatural mystery into a deeply human tragedy of caution and misfortune. The story of the Mary Celeste did not end with the salvage hearing in Gibraltar. The ship herself seemed destined to live out her unlucky reputation. James Winchester, her principal owner, eventually got her back, but she was a pariah. The newspapers were full of stories of her ghost crew and cursed voyage. Sailors are a superstitious lot, and few wanted to serve on her. Over the next decade, she passed through the hands of 17 different owners, a decaying, loss-making albatross of the seas. Her final voyage came in 1884, under the ownership of a disgraced and desperate man named Gilman C. Parker. In a final criminal act, Parker entered into a conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. He overloaded the ship with a worthless cargo of scrap metal, old rubber boots, and cat food, but insured it for the handsome sum of $30,000. He then deliberately sailed her onto the Rochelet Reef in Haiti, intending to scuttle her and collect the insurance money. But the Mary Celeste refused to cooperate. The old ship, built of sturdy Nova Scotian wood, did not sink as planned. She remained stuck fast on the reef. The subsequent investigation easily exposed the fraud. Parker and his conspirators were arrested, but the ghost ship had delivered its fina. Bit of misfortune. She was left to rot on the reef, where the sea and the sun slowly broke her apart, erasing her physical presence from the world. So we are left at the end with an absence of people, an absence of answers, an absence of certainty. The anatomy of this particular mystery is not defined by what was found, but by what was missing. 10 people, from a 2-year-old girl to a seasoned German sailor, stepped off their ship and into a void. The vapor explosion theory is the most likely explanation we have. It is rational. It is supported by the evidence, and it aligns with what we know about the people and the circumstances. It replaces a ghost story with a tragedy of miscalculation and misfortune. It transforms Captain Benjamin Briggs from a figure in a horror story to a competent man who, in a moment of perceived crisis, likely made a prudent decision that, through a simple twist of fate, a snapped rope, led to an unimaginable catastrophe. Yet, despite the logic of this explanation, the story of the Mary Celeste retains its power, its chilling grip on our collective imagination. It does so because there is no final proof. There are no bodies, no confessions, no definitive last words from a survivor. The theory, however strong, remains a theory. The silence from the deck of the Mary Celeste has never been truly broken. The mystery endures because it speaks to a fundamental human fear, the fear of the unknown and the terrifying knowledge that the world is a vast indifferent place where people can simply disappear without a trace. The ship itself may be gone, a ghost of timbers and iron now scattered on a Caribbean reef, but the enigma of what happened during those 9 days between the last log entry and the moment of discovery remains perfectly preserved. The Mary Celeste sails on, a silent monument to the ocean's ability to keep its secrets. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.